Welcome to the GreatBase Tennis Podcast, episode 65. I'm Steve Smith with my partner in crime, Brandon Flanagan. We're going to talk about interior design, actually memorabilia. Why don't you start, Brandon, with the FM Performance Center, Boynton Beach, FM Tennis Performance Center. It's amazing, grade 5, just what's on the walls. Brings back so many stories from the past.
We really swerved off the path here of forehands and backhands to interior design, but I think it's a place that, as Steve said, I said 99% of tennis players would really appreciate the way it's designed, and he said no, 100%. And so as you walk in, we've got all types of tennis memorabilia on the walls, everything from a evolution of the tennis racket, which is quite interesting, to go from the earlier wooden rackets all the way up to, I think, the Roger Federer Wilson Pro Staff that came out a couple years ago. And then as you're kind of walking in the entrance, you see a huge photo of my personal favorite tennis player is Andre Agassi. And it says, hit the ball as loud as you can. And of course, it's a backhand, and he's lifted so much that he's elevated off the ground. But for me, Agassi is my favorite based on, what he did for the sport in terms of the image, going from, the very preppy, all-white country clubs to bringing a bit of style and the neon colors and the long bleach blonde hair, which we found out later, of course, was not hair at all. It was just a wig. But he was one of the main inspirations for me getting involved in tennis early on. So that's a pretty cool piece. But as you kind of continue down the hallway, we have all these Sports Illustrated covers, and we'll go through those one by one and kind of tick off some stories. But it's pretty cool just to go online and take a look at all the moments in history that have been big enough in the sport of tennis to grant a Sports Illustrated cover. I thought about getting one that said, "Is tennis dying?" And that was about 2003, I think, but I decided against it. But it's interesting.
I remember that. It was the red clay or the orange cover with the tennis ball.
Yeah. But I think as you're walking in, you also see a kind of an homage to Wimbledon. And I know, Steve, you've talked about this time and time again. Good for the listeners to hear you talk about it. But there's a official Wimbledon poster, and it looks very, very much like they're just having tea. And in the background is a grass tennis court. But I think the way you tell that history of tennis is the best. So I'm going to pass it over to you.
Well, Sir Walter Clapton Wingfield, the tennis court's based on the size of his backyard. The rules were put in place in 1873 with, I always tell people when we talk about the serve, it's called a serve because it was a garden party, and the servant put the ball in play from the side of the court. But I like what you have on top as you walk in is the same saying from Kipling that's posted in the 2-minute waiting room before the players enter center court.
If you meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters just the same. And I remember as a player, being coached by you many years ago, you would add ... and still be a champion.
Yeah. If you treat those two imposters just the same, with in the English version, the way imposters is spelled, it works either way. But kids just need to just really understand that, not just a soundbite, but the depth of it.
But also, if is the biggest word in the dictionary.
Yeah, we interviewed Rob Krychek. Don't be an iffer. If you did this and if you did that.
I think there's probably a huge part of the tennis playing population that don't know about the waiting room. I don't think there's a whole lot of coverage every year, but it's pretty cool that they have to wait in that area before they enter center court. On the left is, and I could be messing this up in terms of direction, on the left is the last year's women's singles champion. On the right is the previous year's men's singles champion. And then right in the middle is that quote in an aluminum sign. And that's really all they can look at as they walk out to center court. Pretty cool.
Yeah, Wimbledon. I was there one time with Doug McCurdy, an American. He was working with the ITF. And before the ITF moved to the Queen's Club, their offices were at Wimbledon. And so I was in his office. It was not during the tournament. I goes, "This is a really cool office." And he goes, "Well, let me show you a real cool office." And we went across the hall, and the gentleman, you could look out his window. You could, through his window, you saw center court.
Wow.
With Sports Illustrated, it's interesting. Go back to the years and all the covers that you could choose. It's like, like say a Jordan or Gretzky, Ali. and do the history on that, who's been on the cover the most times.
I think the oldest one that we have is the Althea Gibson. If I were to look at the date, I think that's the oldest one we have.
Yeah, I was helping Dave Fish. He asked me, Dave Fish is someone that both Brandon and I have had a lot to do with. When we talked a little about his Harvard tennis camp years ago, he retired as a Harvard coach, but he's a proponent of spec rackets and uses the term bridge sports. And I think, hey, more power to pickleball. They're having fun. It's great. But to play spec tennis, it really is just a spin-off of not platform tennis, but paddle tennis. Platform tennis, where we grew up in upstate New York, it's the cage and the ball can go off and it hit. I don't know enough. I've played it a couple of times, but I don't really know that sport. But Roosevelt thought the tennis courts were too big for public parks. So he wanted them to go from service line to service line and have more courts and 3 different places in the United States. And there's one still out in Venice Beach, but in the New York area where Gibson grew up, there was one put in her backyard. So you play with, and the spec tennis is very much the same, although the racket's different now. And they're recommending to play with an orange ball or a green dot ball. And you can even play on a pickleball court, but just service line to service line. Bobby Riggs and Pancho Gonzalez started that way, but Althea Gibson in her backyard, you play with a punctured tennis ball, and it's just all serve and volley.
Interesting.
It's all serve and volley. And with Gibson, the men were all away at war during World War II. If you've seen the movie A League of Their Own, Tom Hanks with Madonna, there's no crying in baseball. Well, so Althea Gibson, she could throw a ball. And it was certainly so unfair for an African-American at that time, even someone who I later spent a lot of time with, Angela Buxton, who was Jewish. And there's many clubs that blacks were not allowed, Jewish people were not allowed. And they teamed up and they did well playing doubles together. But yeah, Althea Gibson, she could serve and she could come in and volley. People should get on YouTube and look at old film.
Oh yeah,
Althea
she's
Gibson.
incredible.
And just talk about hardship and what she overcame. The backstory is like, before Arthur Ashe, there was Althea Gibson.
Right.
So.
Before you enter this kind of hallway of Sports Illustrated covers, there's another photo of my main man, Andre Agassi, and it's him at Wimbledon, so it kind of fits in with the theme. But right underneath it says mowing the lawn, and he's hitting a backhand. Again, he's off the ground, and there's the old saying, a picture can tell 1,000 words. I mean, you can look at the technique from that backhand photo, everything from the grip to the chin being under the shoulder, super long hitting zone. To be able to lift that explosively and rotate that much to get off the ground is one thing, but you can even see the position of the legs.
I tell people that they really should read Mike Agassi's book before they read Andre's book. I do think in some ways Andre threw Mike under the bus. His father says now that you should have played golf, you should have played baseball, you could have played longer. But it's interesting, just the stories. I think of Peter Graf with Steffi. So the two fathers meet, and right away Mike Agassi saying that Steffi, she should have had a 2-handed backhand. She should have 2 back. So I guess they started, it's in the book, they started arguing right away. But
wow. With
Mike, Andres, he's the youngest of 4. Rita, Phil, and then Tammy. Tammy went to Tyler Junior College, so I watched her practice every day for a year. And she was a fighter. Not only did she fight her way up the tennis ladder, she played at Texas A&M after TJC. Then she had to fight through cancer. But you just, you watch one sibling hit the ball, and then Andre hit the ball, and it's like, how did this happen? Well, Andre being the youngest of the 4, Mike was some immigrant from Iran. He's working as a bellhop in Chicago. He finds his way to Las Vegas, and he saved enough money where he's going to buy a house. It's an amazing story. So he's with a realtor. He never sees the house. They're going to walk, the real estate agent's going to walk up the front door, and Mr. Agassi, he goes, I want to see the backyard first. So he marks off just walking the distance, 120 by 60, and he never saw the inside of the house. He goes, I'll take it. That's a man with a plan. And really, I think out of fatigue, out of survival as well. So people now know about the souped up ball machine and a minimum of 2,500 balls a day. But the oldest three children didn't have that. I mean, they all have different backgrounds, like all of us. Like Rita, she took lessons from Pancho Gonzalez. I mean, she was married to Pancho Gonzalez, and they had a child together. But Andre, how did somebody learn to hit the ball so well? I don't think anyone ever has used their legs as well as he has.
Yeah, that's true.
How he just uncoils from the ground. And, when he first came on the scene, he really didn't hit a conventional volley. Way back when people would hit a swing volley, it's like, oh, you're not supposed to do that. And, now that's readily acceptable. But I think some things like one-up, one-back doubles should not be readily acceptable. But the ball came so fast that, he held the racket higher, longer to get the speed of the racket falling, hit it away from his body. He found and also too fatigue, when the ball just keeps coming and coming and coming. One of the best times we've talked to Jim Lair, one of the best times to talk to an athlete is when they're really fatigued. But also too, not only will they listen because they can't talk, they're just breath in, breath out, but when they're really exhausted, they become efficient. They eliminate the extra moving parts.
Right.
But, there's a guy with Agassi. He really didn't have the first serve. He had a toss too far over his head. Vic Braden asked one time in an interview, Andre, why don't you come to the net? He said, Vic, have you ever seen me volley? And he one time was playing against Steve Denton, and he's playing with Kriegstein. Denton's playing with Kevin Curran. Agassi throws the ball over his head, and he stays back. And Denton, just out of intimidation, he catches the ball and goes, really? You did that right in the middle of the match. But, I mean, what a clean ball striker, though. I saw him play one time against Nadal. He was 36, and he, if he could have just come in, because he would open up the court,
right? And
he was really, he could just hit through people.
It's really interesting, and obviously now there's so much tennis being taught with scaled down courts, scaled down rackets, and that's an example of, you have photos of Andre hitting balls when he was 5-6 years old with almost a full size. Well, it looks like a full size to me anyways, a pretty big, heavy wooden racket with yellow balls, and he figured it out. He's got incredibly efficient swings.
Different regimes, there's been different people in charge of player development. Rob Krychek put this together. His son was, if not one, he was one of the top tennis players in the 18s in the U.S., and he had read where Craig Tiley was at that time in charge of player development at Tennis Australia. He said, it's going to take me 10 years to develop a coaching network. So Rob calls the USTA. At that time, Paul Roddick was in charge and said, he's my third person. Steve Smith already has a network. And we ended up meeting with Paul, and we met with him for almost 5 hours. And then we met with the second and third people in charge. And number 2 and number 3, they weren't too interested. He actually had one of them call me up and apologize, because I had done my homework on what they had both said at recent tennis teaching conferences. So I have this film that everybody has now, but back in the day, when I had an academic program, I had lab assistants. And one of them, it varied from time to time, but their job was to make sure that they taped everything that was on TV.
Wow.
So we would, on a VHS, we would just film. And I go back to reel, and beta, VHS, DVD. But anyway, with the film, it's young Pete Sampras. And it's Robert Lansdorp feeding balls, Smiley Pete. And he hits a forehand ground stroke, forehand approach. He hits a two-handed backhand volley, overhead. I think it's just 4 shots. I've seen it so many times. So I was showing that, and one of the assistants said, you're not skill testing a 10-year-old on a full-size court. And I just, I was going to let her ask it a second time, a little experience, and she asked it a second time. And then she said, because I have 2 children who play, and in Florida, they were both ranked pretty high. And they were both of them, Mikhail and Connor. Mikhail in the early age groups. He was easily one of the best, and Connor in the older age groups. In Florida, it was, 1 or 2, both of them, one on the beginning side, one on the end. So she said, is that your son? I said, no, that's Pete Sampras. So I do think that you can skill test a a young player on a full-size court.
As we're going through all these names of kind of tennis players from the past, Bjorn Borg, Jimmy Connors, John McEnroe, talk about impersonating tennis players on the court with strokes. Mikhail was the best at that. You could do Bjorn Borg and McEnroe, like unbelievable.
Yeah, before I knew anything about tennis, I used to do the same thing. Now I know a little bit, but yeah, I one time with Jimmy, never got a chance to do it with Bjorn, but I did my Jimmy Connors impression for Jimmy. He didn't think it was too funny. I mean, I could just go on and on with. Well, we do often on rainy days. We'll take a group of juniors and I say, okay, name a player, name a country, or name a college, and I just tell a story.
Right.
I one time was in a Stowe, Vermont, top notch. Actually, it was funny. I was asked to just stand behind the counter, and one of the coaches and someone said, "Could you just watch the desk for a minute?" I go, "Yeah." So Connors comes in. That was when the NTR just came out. Are you a 1-0, a 2-0, or 2-5, 3-5? So Connors shows up, and I said, "Well, excuse me, sir." And it was just right there on the counter. I said, "If you'd read the chart, you could tell me what level you are, and we could try to find a game for you." So I just pretended didn't know Jimmy. But anyway, Woody Blocker, who was a very good tennis player, Connors was complaining about his back, and Woody said, if you just, Jimmy being a lefty, he said, if you wouldn't toss the ball so far over your head, you toss it out to the left. And he went ballistic. My record, I'm so sick and tired of people telling me about my serve. And, Jimmy used to not be a member of the Vic Braden fan club. He's one of the only few who wasn't a member of the Vic Braden fan club, because Vic used to say that Jimmy's serve only goes 74 miles an hour, 72 miles an hour, but his grunt goes 105. But no, the photos, I would like to actually do that with you sometimes. Just go to Sports Illustrated and just see all the ones there. And then also just like the captions.
The captions are great for a couple different reasons. I mean, they're usually pretty, they use puns and it's pretty clever and funny, but also you can see in other parts of the front cover of the magazine is moments in sport history at the same time that was going on. So there's a cover of Navratilova, and on the front I think it says, "In West Germany reigns in soccer." So that's obviously a bit dated now, but it's interesting. There's a snapshot in time, really. But yeah, you can go on Sports Illustrated covers.com and you can buy these incredible prints of any of the covers that they have come out with over the years.
Here's a random story for you. Upstate New York. Brandon and I are both from the country, Hicks versus Slicks. So my mother sells a house. I'm the youngest of 6, and she went back to work when I went to elementary school, first grade. During the war, World War II, she was pulled out of college, and she worked in the War Department as a secretary. So when I went back to school, or I went to school for the first time, she went back to work. So she sold our house without real estate in 1964. And then she got into real estate, and she was very successful at it. Never wrote anything down. And one of the long-time family friends, Jack Lyons, everybody called her Ty for Tycoon. So she sold a house to Rita Mae Brown, a small town upstate New York. Used to say it's a postcard, but I guess you have to say now it's a screensaver. It's a real beautiful place, small lake. And anyway, Rita Mae Brown's a famous author, but one time, the rumor is that she was married to Martina, but Martina was with Rita Mae Brown, Casanova, New York.
Interesting.
That's a bit of upstate New York history for you.
So yeah, Martina is on a cover there, and just doing a little bit of research. This is actually during the pandemic. I wrote a blog post about 7 tennis pandemics. To use the word pandemic is probably not fair in some respects, but essentially something that spreads like wildfire. And one of them was Martina really being the first player to use a team of people, not just one coach, but multiple people helping her with her game. And one of those was Nancy Lieberman,
basketball player,
professional basketball player, and a really, really good one. And to really help her with her physical off-court training, she was pretty critical of her routines off the court. I guess it wasn't really much of anything. And at the time, that might have been the standard. I think not too long before, people were smoking cigarettes on the side of the court, so drinking Coke. But no, Nancy Lieberman, Dr. Renee Richards, and initially she was mocked for having this huge group of people helping her and traveling, or usually a player would go on the tour without a coach at all or a hitting partner or anything. And then what followed was just an incredible run of dominance. And
I remember I got to know the late Tim Gullison quite well, and I used to say, you riding first class or you riding coach? Because she had so many people on her team. Actually, Dave Anderson, who's been on the podcast, has been part of what we do for so many years now, close to 40, at his tennis facility, the flagship. I think of it as his tennis facility. Club Corp, it's the flagship in Dallas, Brookhaven. And there's a court that was built for Martina. She practiced there way back in the 80s.
Interesting. Had to have wide fences, I'm sure, for the lefty slice.
Well, you just think about Navratilova, the players from the past. Heard Vince Spadea say this one time. You were making fun of old school, and Vince, who I would never say I coached Vince Spadea, but he was a student, very short term, and I was working with him under Robbie Seguzo, who had his own tennis academy with the wife, Seguzo Bassett. And Vince said, there's a lot of things they did better than us. And really, when you think service line in.
Right.
But it's, it was the times, it was the rackets. I mean, I always tell people in the United States at one time, initially you couldn't be ranked until you're 13 years old. Right.
It's just reps, too. I mean, look at Djokovic beating Medvedev in the Paris Masters. He was serving and volleying a lot, and he was having more success than he did when he lost him at the U.S. Open. So if these guys were to do it more.
Like if they didn't change the grass at Wimbledon, the first year they had changed the grass, Bandy and Hewitt were in the final. There was not 1 point where someone served and volleyed.
Yeah.
Not 1 point.
And coming back to old school versus new school, there's another photo of Bjorn Borg. And every time I see Bjorn Borg, I almost have to think about the Bjorn Borg-Roger Federer comparison video. We would watch that every summer camp just to show the kids that, old school mechanics are essentially
just go
at
to
the
YouTube.
end of the day.
Plug it in.
It's a great clip, but it's a photo of Borg. I might be butchering the date, but I think it's 1980, the date of the cover. But it's an open stance forehand, and there's a lot of people who were being taught in 1980. They were being told that you couldn't hit the ball with an open stance forehand, and then now people today saying you should never hit the ball with a close stance or a neutral stance forehand. So I think there's so many more similarities in the way that players played back then to the way they hit the ball now, and there's always that kind of one new
it's like,
hot thing to focus on.
It's like Big Bill and Little Bill, Bill Tilden, Bill Johnson. Bill Johnson had an extreme grip. Kim Wittenberg, we need to get Kim Wittenberg on a podcast. Kim Wittenberg, Untapped. Borg did not have a Western grip, but because the way he had his elbow up and the way he closed the racket face, people just said, he has a Western grip. That's one thing that has improved. It's gone too extreme with the grip, but the forehand's improved because people used to teach with one grip, and it used to be 180-degree swing, penny on edge, shake hands one way, shake hands the other way.
Right.
Point the racket at the fence behind you, point the racket at the fence in front of you, and that's a 180-degree swing on a 20-degree court. But I mean, I could tell Borg stories forever with, I was born in 1954. Borg, I believe, is 56. And, you just read and just sit back, and Borg, unbelievable. But
I think based on that hockey photo you used to have hair like Borg too, which is pretty amazing.
With back in the 70s, that was the thing. But with Borg, I talked to Mark Hamlin the other day, talk about Casanova, New York. So we grew up together playing hockey, and he loved sports. And I said, tennis was booming, and he like so many people in their 20s, didn't really know what he wanted to do. And I said, hey, you're an athlete, you got great people skills, you should get into tennis. And he has had his long career in tennis. He's in Germany now, been there for years. So the Swedes were doing so well. They had 6 guys in the top 10. So Hamlin and I, we went to Stockholm for a week. We drove up from Germany. And so we were told to take booze because booze is so expensive. I've gone to many different countries. In Russia, it was bubble gum. And in old Czechoslovakia, it was tennis ball, new tennis balls. So we drive. So we have this little car, a little Japanese car. I go, Hamlin, we need to have a German car. But so we drive up, and I buy 2 cases of booze. And this one gentleman was so nice to us. I say, hey, come out of the parking lot, I have a gift for you. So you just give 2 bottles. He said, why don't you guys come back tonight? And it was the first Wimbledon. It was during the first Wimbledon that Borg had not played. And, there's many things to that story. It's like, okay, the guy's climbed Mount Everest 5 times. He was in the finals 6 times in a row. So anyway, we went back to the club that night, and Borg was practicing with Berglund and one other, Leonard Berglund's coach, and one other person. But actually, Mark McCormick, the late Mark McCormick, just the brash American, he wrote the book, What They Don't Teach in the Harvard Business School. And he started IMG. So Borg, 1 year after, he wanted to play. And Mark McCormick had told him that he'd get him a wild card. At that time, there was no such thing as a wild card. But McCormick, with his golfing background, keep plugging Casanova, New York tonight, Bob Trum Jr. is my age. His father was Arnold Palmer's ghostwriter. So at golf, if you win the Masters, for example, you're in the Masters the rest of your life. You just show up and go, okay, you won this thing, you're in. But Borg, his intentions were to play the year after. But it was just kind of intriguing, to be in Sweden, just trying to find out what are they doing to be so successful. And so we're watching Borg practice, and the club had closed. Of course, in that time of the year in Sweden, they have these special windows because the sun doesn't go down until midnight.
Well, the Swedes, such an incredible run they had during that era, but I think a lot of that was attributed to the mini tennis, which then the LTA brought over shortly after. But so there's so many benefits to getting kids to rally, and so
no, for sure. If you don't rally, and I think that people can be hooked once they can start to rally.
Oh yeah, it's addicting.
So that's where initially you can be too fanatical about teaching skill.
Right.
Just let the kid have some fun and rally ball back and forth. One other thing they did, Percy Roseberg, he's famous for his background in tennis teaching. He didn't change Borg from a one-hander to a two-hander, but he did change Edberg. But the Swedes at one time they called it animators. Just like we in this country, without even trying, we had all these dads, basically, because way back when it wasn't fair for girls. If a girl played sports, they were a tomboy. You don't even hear that word anymore. But 10,000 animators to be able to demonstrate a basic forehand, backhand, and get people playing. But yeah, so Borg was a mystery. But then when Wielander came along, and then he won, and then Sundström and Nyström, and it was just Jared. It was just amazing. But there's a lot to be said about psychology. It's like when Roger Bannister in 1954 broke the 4-minute mile, people said it never could be done. I think it was 4 times within the same year that people broke it. So that's where, I could just elaborate upon if you think you can, you can.
Right. Similar with Becker and Steek, right?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite stories is that Boris Becker wins Wimbledon in 85. I was in Germany. And then I was at a Davis Cup tie in July, right after that. But Michael Steek, they were 8-8 in juniors. And Steek had gone off to university, and he went 1 semester. And he convinced his parents, if Becker can win Wimbledon, I can be a pro. But 5 years later, he beat Becker in Wimbledon final.
So cool.
With
I think another interesting thing about Borg is the effect of the two-handed backhand and how so many players were one-handed. I think you can probably say, well, that's a bit conflated by the change in the racket technology, but he was so popular in the 70s. Not that I'm speaking from experience. I wasn't born yet, but just the popularity of him and Chrissy Evert and Jimmy Connors, and then to see the effect of that on the next generation of the Agassis and Kricksteins and, go all the way down the list.
Yeah, when I first got into tennis, there had been players in the past that had a two-handed backhand, been two-handed on both sides. There's players, Beverly Baker Flight, she hit 2 forehands. So it's not like there's anything new, but
right.
But then it was the tennis boom. What happened was the tiebreaker put tennis on TV, Jimmy Connors, with his personality, he became pretty much the Muhammad Ali of tennis. Tennis just boomed, and now it's totally the opposite. Where now it's the one-hander. But actually, at Borg playing hockey, it's just amazing to me that all hockey players if they shoot left-handed, it's just the opposite. They shoot right-handed, but their bottom hand is an Eastern forehand grip, and their top hand is continental.
That racket's incredible. The Dunne racket, the black, red, and orange, and how long the grip is compared to other wooden rackets at the time. We have that hanging on the walls here somewhere as well.
I love all the old rackets you have up with. Back in the day, what the tennis players would do, I think of John Newcomb, for example, he used Rawlings, he used Slazenger, for sure. I mean, some of them were using a different racket on every continent because when they would show up in Australia, okay, we're sponsored by this racket.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Talk about being tough. It's like,
yeah.
Now people have someone traveling with them, stringing
to string them, and they'll change their tension based on the altitude and the temperature. The
top players used to play all 3 events just so they could have meals. I mean, it was amateurs.
Amazing.
There was no money in the game until it boomed in '68.
Even then, if you look at the money that some of the best players of that era made, it pales in comparison to today.
Yeah, I mean, Connor's coming on the scene when he would be fined and be suspended. He's breakthrough guy where he can make more money playing exos.
Yeah, and you've talked about that before, I'm sure, on the podcast, but just it's so interesting, the history of tennis, that they would rather play some of these exhibitions or the history of world team tennis versus the Grand Slams, and how not, Grand Slams, how many Grand Slams a player wins, really hasn't been the metric for players' greatness for that long of a period of time.
Yeah, we'll get back to that, the Grand Slams in tennis history. His tennis history is very complex, but John Lloyd, who's basically the same age as Connors, that age group, when they got into tennis as kids, and that's where you have to, I think, really respect people that are playing, say, volleyball or track and field. There's so many people in sports where they know they're not going to make very much money. I mean, to really digress, I think that this country, like women's basketball, I mean, it's like when you go to high school and there's a varsity game and a JV game. I think it's no secret that the men are getting bigger crowds in the NBA than the women in the WNBA. But it should be like a varsity and a JV. I mean, there should be 2 teams out of Miami, and that's really where the money should go, to support women's tennis.
Right.
Or women's, and that's, I guess, basketball.
Right.
Women's tennis, that's another whole deal. The money they make in comparison to other sports. But coming back to Grand Slams, like Jimmy Connors was banned in 1974 from playing the French because he was a contract athlete. He started to play for the Baltimore Banners. Bill Reardon, his manager from Maryland, was managing that team, and so he was banned. He wasn't allowed to play the French, so he didn't go back for 5 years. The players basically, if you look it up, I mean, I'd be off track guessing, but I think Borg played the Australian once.
Right.
Connors, I mean, I'm going to guess twice.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, that's really, and I could be wrong on this, but I think that's where Djokovic has dominated the most. I mean, and Agassi as well, where they collected their most Grand Slams. But so to think that that's the best way to measure a player's greatness.
It used to be right before Christmas as well. It was in December. If you look in the record books, there was one year it was held twice because, it was held in December, then it skipped December and went to January, so it was 13 months later.
Coming back to women's tennis, there's a photo of Venus Williams as well, and the caption's great. It says, it's 1997, and it said braids. Well, I don't know if this is the caption or just the photo, but I think the photo is her with the braids and the and braces. So she's young enough to still have braces, and she's someone who lives in the area, at least spends some of her time here. I think it's incredible what she's accomplished, obviously, to say the least. But she does train at a city facility in Palm Beach Gardens. It's probably one of the nicest city facilities in the country. They've won many awards. I'm sure you've been there. But
I remember playing there years ago.
They've recently renovated. It's beautiful, and some of our students were playing a middle school tennis match there, and she was training, and they sent me a video of her, and I go, she's playing left-handed. So part of her training was playing left-handed, which from a technical standpoint can really help for the two-handed backhand. But then, of course, from a physical standpoint, players are doing so much with their dominant arm. And one thing I always will tell players when we're working with them, just kind of partially joking, but partially being serious, is just try brushing your teeth with your left hand. And I had a very, very smart, and then the nice thing about tennis, of course, is you do get a chance to meet so many different people from so many different professions and a lot of very intelligent people from all walks of life. And one of my students says, yeah, I brush my teeth with my left hand every night. It's really good for your brain.
Wow.
And so I always tell people, just brush your teeth with your left hand. And it's a nice little skill. But to see her practice left-handed, a lot of the parents say, that's not Venus Williams. She's not left-handed. That's definitely not her. Then she switched back to right-handed. But it's incredible, what she's done. And the likelihood of her winning another major tournament is probably very small, but it would be great to see her to continue to have success.
I'd love to see her just keep playing.
Yeah.
For her to stay in the top 104, to be straight into the Grand Slams, that's doable for a few more years for sure. With Hopman used to have his players, Harry Hopman, the great Mr. Hopman, had his players play squash with their opposite hand. Certainly overloading, if you're just,
oh, yeah.
That's certainly a problem. Well, I can't wait November 19th, a movie to come out, King Richard. I was called by the people making the movie, and I was asked for a copy, and there's a scene in the movie that's from a videotape that Richard Williams sent to Vic Braden. The girls are 15 months apart. And Venus basically stopped playing when she was 10, playing tournaments, and she was dominating Southern California, based out of Compton. But Vic used to travel with this heavy shoulder bag, and he had all these DVDs, and he gave me several copies of this, that, and the other thing, and he gave me a copy of that. And then it's on YouTube. You just put GreatBase Tennis, Venus, Serena. It was a tape. So I was asked about the rights, and I said, it's Richard's film. Richard's the one who filmed it and sent it to Vic. But it's for the listeners, they see the movie, it's where they're very young, and I don't know if I haven't seen the movie, obviously, but one of the girls, I think it's Venus, is wearing a long fur coat, and they're really young, and they're posing for a photo shoot for Vic Braden. They hit balls, and they say hello to him. And no, that story is amazing. I met Richard, and it was in the early 90s. Rick Macy wanted to merge with the Seguso Bassett Tennis Academy. I was interviewed, so Robbie's brother, calls me up, and I fly in, and within a week, Dave Anderson came to join me, so I came back to Boca, because I had been Boca off and on, winters mostly, not summers, between 74 and 79. And with Rick Macy wanted to merge, so he had rented too many courts, and right here, it seems like a couple golf shots away from your performance center. Now it's the Delray Beach Tennis Center, right?
The swim club.
Swim club. So I remember Dave Anderson said, you just need to go up there. So I went day after day to just watch, and it was Rick Macy. Richard was wearing blue jeans and street shoes, and he's feeding balls. And I remember shaking hands with Venus. It was like meeting someone in the NBA. She was so tall. And Rick said, well, I'd introduce you to Serena, but she might bite your finger off. And they hit balls all day, every day. But he was very curious. We never worked with them. But initially, they were watching Braden tapes, and that's what his mission was, to try to get Vic more involved. That never happened. But with Richard, I remember 2 different times where I was in a room making videos, and Richard was watching me, and I kind of went, whoa. But he was a very, very curious guy. And I just think that the thought of those girls not playing junior tennis, that's covered in the movie. I mean, we tell kids every day is a tournament, and you got to play, with the idea of what are your long-term goals. And one thing for me as well, I think everybody, they were playing home run derby when they were making so many mistakes when they played tennis. They were teeing off on every ball. So they were the ones who really, on women's tennis, said, okay, this is how you return serve. And so, no, I think they definitely lifted the level of tennis by being so aggressive.
Right.
They certainly were influenced by others. I mean, Billie Jean King, she's on one of those Sports Illustrated covers. Talk about Billie Jean King stories, but I remember her just saying, they were playing one up, one back, and, what are you girls doing? And, I think everybody in tennis, the clock stops when Billy talks, and we're listening.
I'll be curious to hear how they train the girls, the two young girls who play Venus and Serena, how they trained them, or if they were already tennis players, or if they did train them how to play.
I read a few things already where I know Will Smith made $40 million with, but he gave a lot of gifts to the people that were part of the movie. They didn't say how much, but just super generous. I think it's going to be very, very good. I think with it's dramatic. I know that we're just have read that. So people telling them, no, you this is unconventional. You can't do it this way. You can't do it that way. But I think one thing too, that they work so hard.
Yeah,
they hit so many balls, and like you said about Navratilova, she game before them, and there's things that Martina did better. It's like from the service line in,
right.
Cleaner volleys. Like Venus and Serena, everybody has inefficiencies. No one is like just perfect when it comes down to being biomechanically sound.
Well, there's probably a chance that, and you would know this. This is not. I don't have the tennis history nailed down like you do, but there's probably a chance that they had crossed paths in a doubles draw somewhere, based on when Martina stopped playing doubles and when the Williams sisters started playing.
I wouldn't know that, but that's the late Bud Collins would know that.
He would know that.
I think that Martina may have, because she won when she was 50.
Yeah, amazing. Absolutely amazing.
And I always say that that's a compliment to Martina, but that's not a compliment to women's tennis.
Right.
What she has gone on record without, maybe she's not even conscious of saying it, but mixed doubles is still real doubles. The way she could serve and volley and go forward. Chris Everett, has made a comment. Well, when I got on the tour, no one could hit ground strokes. But the grass, you go back and look at film, the players stood by the umpire. There weren't even chairs. And then when it rained at Wimbledon, they had no, crew, an army of people pulling the tarp over the court. And, by the second week, players were wearing spikes. And it was like, whatever you do, don't let the ball bounce.
Yeah.
But with Billie, so many stories of Billie Jean King, but Mervyn Rose, a great Australian tennis player, was really known for his coaching as well. She went all the way to Australia. There was no tournament. She went down there to work on her game. She went down there to work on her forehand. And she came back and she said, my forehand's awesome. My forehand's my best side. I love my forehand. I love my forehand. She kept telling people, I love my forehand. I improved my forehand so much. And then afterwards, she said it was all a bluff. She goes, I was still always struggling with my forehand.
Interesting.
But yeah, Billie Jean King. Yeah, I think that's missing with tennis. I do think what Roger Federer has done with the Laver Cup, and he told Tony Godsick, I make more in one exhibition than Rod Laver made in his whole career. And that's part of the reason that whole thing came about. But to really study the game, it's just amazing to me where kids are lacking skills. They're not complete players. Certainly the big money coming into it. I think would have been great years ago. And Billie Jean King, she pushed for boys and girls to be in the same age group when they were 12. Just more tennis being played. A lot of times you go to a 12-hour tournament, the best player there is a girl, not the boy.
Right.
and maybe even into the 14s. Billie was, always fighting for equal prize money for women, but she was fighting for equal prize money for doubles. And the division, it's I believe it's 20% goes to doubles, then you got to split it.
All right.
And wouldn't it be great if the best players in the world, even like a Federer, he back and just played doubles, but if it was a bonus pool where the bonus money went to the people who had the best combination, it would really help junior tennis. Here in Florida at one time, late Bobby Curtis, great guy, and I remember him just saying, well, as an organization, we don't have enough guts. Because at one point, 15% of your singles ranking was based on your doubles. And at one point in Florida, one weekend a month was just doubles only, but people weren't playing. People weren't playing. So there's been a lot of smart people that have fought for the right causes in tennis, but didn't work.
So one thing we do coach a lot of players who only play doubles. Of course, the recreational player who, for different reasons, they're in a doubles league and they don't really have any interest in playing singles. And I'm always telling them, try to watch doubles on TV, but it's so hard to come across it during a Grand Slam. I think it's easier now. The Tennis Channel does such a great job of getting so many different courts on TV. If you get Tennis Channel Plus, and you can kind of surf around and choose the court, but just to watch how the players move, the net player in a situation, the server's partner, the returner's partner, how they move, how they're so active, it's such a key to great doubles, but they just don't show it enough because the marquee players aren't playing.
Yeah, there's so many points to make on both sides of that comment. With Indian Wells, which is not a full 2 weeks, but the players come from the indoor season, they show up at Indian Wells, and it's like, okay, I'd like to hang out in the desert a little bit longer. And the singles players say, I'll throw my hat in and I'll play doubles. So they bump, say somebody's ranked,
right,
whatever the number may be, someone's ranked 40, and they're normally they would get into the doubles, but someone who's ranked 39 gets in ahead of them.
I always think of Raven in those situations, and I think one thing that Raven pointed out years ago, Raven's obviously world-class doubles player, has had so many great results, and one thing he mentioned is that the behavior of the top players.
Yeah, you're saying about Raven?
Yeah, so just many conversations with Raven, someone who had the privilege really of spending a great deal of time around in Tampa, Florida. A world-class doubles player, has had incredible results in the doubles tour, and also obviously did pretty well in singles before he committed to doubles. He would always say, if you really watch the professional players and how they handle themselves, one of the reasons they handle themselves with so much class has to be because they know that so many people are watching. And their behavior, really does influence the behavior of so many others. And I've always thought of that as far as Roger. I think Roger's such an incredible sportsman and classy guy that if there were anyone who were to stick around and play doubles, if he weren't able to compete in singles, it would probably be him. I think he's pretty aware of the impact he has on how he fills seats and how healthy it is for him to still be playing the game. I think that's got to be one of his main motivations. Obviously, his kids watching him play, but I think to get people to turn on the TV and to get people to come and watch, I could totally see him doing that.
Well, Roger Federer is going to be an Arnold Palmer. Arnold Palmer, the great golfer, I mean, he was, lived into his 80s, I believe, and he was still, people were looking for his name and
right.
To tie onto a product, have him endorse it. With doubles, I think it's so sad. At one point, the tournament directors wanted doubles to be dropped because they have to sell tickets.
Right.
And I do think that's where doubles has been put more on more show courts because of the no ad and then the 10-point tiebreaker.
Right.
My son Connor said to me one time, he goes, it's not a match. The players, it is a match who moves on and who earns more money, who accumulates more points, but it's unfortunate. And that's where you talk all day long about the short sets and is to have it come down to a tiebreaker, even though it's a 10-point tiebreaker. But that's interesting too. All 4 Grand Slams have a different ending.
Right.
With how is it? And I mean, if I were to be quizzed, I wouldn't know. I know that the U.S. is 5. It's at 6-all. It's a regular tiebreaker. But it's a good trivia question.
Yeah, the 10-point tiebreaker is definitely not a true test of, like Connor said, not a true test of who's the better tennis player on that day or the better tennis team on that day. And there's no secret, I did play tennis at Furman University, but it really I was not an everyday lineup player. I got a lot out of practicing with the team and was able to play in some matches in the fall and a couple matches here and there in the spring. I always had a much better chance to play in the doubles lineup. In my junior year, Coach Paul Scarpa, he gathers the team together and he says, all right, Brandon, this is your chance. And he puts me with a freshman player, lefty, who's a good player from Texas, actually, probably knows a lot of the same people in the Dave Anderson, Brookhaven world, and Robert Bruner. And as he says what we're going to do, he says, you're going to play best 2 out of 3 super tiebreakers, against senior captains, of course. And as I'm starting to serve to warm up, he's walking away and he turns around and he says, Brandon, if you lose this, you can forget it. We lost 10-8, 10-8, and I did not play in the doubles lineup that year. So that's all you need to know about my tennis career.
Pressure.
With
the tiebreaker, I tell people, as far as tactics is concerned, what you could possibly do, it's got to be decision by decision. You got to feel good about it. You got to go for it. Is become more aggressive in the beginning of the 10-point tiebreaker, because if people pay attention, almost every time, not every time, but very close, the person who gets off to a really good start in the tiebreaker.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
So that's where if you can throw a curveball and throw different tactics in the very, very beginning of a 10-point tiebreaker.
If we're on the topic of Paul Scarpa and doubles, the one more thing to bring up is the switch formation, which is actually on the Craig Tiley Illinois video, which is where he got that from. In some ways, it was borderline illegal, right? Because it's somewhat distracting. But the switch formation was something he had all of us work on in doubles. And we did have really strong doubles at Furman. We won the doubles point, the large majority of the time. But that switch formation was quite interesting.
Yeah, you're the player is about to serve. And if you're going to do this at a junior tournament, you better have a rule book with you. It's not a distraction if you're communicating with your partner. So you toss the ball up in the air and you say switch. So if you're serving deuce court, your partner is, if you're lined up conventional, traditional, so your partner is in the deuce court house and they can cross over. They can cross over, return. They can just, like a football team is running an audible. So if someone says switch, the returning team should both go back to offset. But I picked that up from Tiley, this switch format. I remember when Paul Scarpa, he saw your video, he came right away to see you and spent a couple of days with us. He said he used it all the time.
Yeah.
But Tiley's quite the salesman. He told people that, he got that from the Woodies. And then one of my contacts, actually Brian Clark, a tennis club friend up in Cincinnati, he researched it to the point where someone asked the Woodies and they said they had never heard of it. But you don't see it that much. But now I think we see so much of, and this is something that I saw the other day and I said, oh no, really? It's kind of like the WTA versus the ATP forehand. I mean, come on, a forehand's a forehand. I just think that's such a shot against women. I mean, it's a WTA forehand if the swing is big. Come on, guys, gals. But with classic doubles versus modern doubles, and I don't really think people playing one up, one back, running around backhands, bashing balls is called modern doubles. But I saw that as somebody who's a pretty well-known internet guru has that out, and okay, let's go through. And certainly, I didn't watch the entire tape, but there's a lot of quality points made, but to just call it classic doubles versus
let's call it what it is.
Modern is
singles on half a court with a sitting duck at the net.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
And You mentioned Raven Clausen with, I remember at one point, I think Raven has done so well. I think he has 18 titles that he definitely has earned the ATP pension.
Yeah.
But you just think of, that's U.S. dollars, and you think about the South African rand, it's A-okay for him. But he's, talking about playing Jack Sock. And, Sock, he's such an unorthodox player, but the RPM he's getting on a forehand. But when people are trying to volley with their elbow in and a strong continental grip,
it's not easy.
I remember you being with me one time. We went out to dinner, and I said, "Hey, Raven, forget those pension numbers. Think of these numbers again. You got to get the elbow raised, and you got to get the racket face flatter, and you got to really counter speed with speed. If the ball's coming in at that angle where it's dipping so severely,
right,
and then your racket's going downward, good luck. It's just too much calculation."
Yeah. One more photo down the hallway of Sports Illustrated covers is Jimmy Connors at the 1991 U.S. Open with the neon green racket, pumping his fist. And it says underneath, the people's choice. And that's got to be one of the most, replayed tennis matches, the Krickstein-Connors final. And I think everyone probably feels a little bit bad for Aaron Krickstein. He's a local guy, and he's been interviewed about it before. I think he's probably okay with it now. But for many years, if you had more than 2 or 3 days of rain at the U.S. Open, that's the match they were going to play. And so underneath, I thought it was interesting because he became such a star at that tournament in terms of the fans. Everyone was cheering for him, but that really wasn't the case through most of his career, was it? He wasn't necessarily as popular as Borg.
No, in New York, he turned it around where he won, and he said to the audience, "You might hate me, but I love you." And from that point forth, he was just loved by New York, the New Yorkers.
I love the line, "This is what you want, and this is what you get."
The Open, I mean, for some people, the Open is 3 weeks because of qualifying, but it's a fortnight, 2 weeks. So I was at the University of Illinois, and before Craig Tiley went there and, took the program from obscurity where they won the national championship, Jennifer Roberts preceded him. So I used to go up every Labor Day. Of course, Roberts, she's 32 and she looked 16, and I went in to, set the tone. And I remember we used to do a Peter Burwash drill on the grass, and my goal was every girl's warm-up is going to be wet, grass stained, where, you hit a volley and there's one person in this circle, let's not even start on the tennis court. Let's just shock them. So I don't really think I'm a fan of tennis, but a student of tennis, but I was a fan of Connors, for sure. Love to watch Connors play. And so I'm in Illinois, and this is long before cell phones, and the telethon comes on TV. So they stopped showing the match. And I remember I got on the phone with a gal that was helping me out, Helen Harrison. Said, "Harrison, don't hang up." And she was just giving me the play-by-play. Of course, that was the first week. By the second week of the Open, because I would go up there when school would be starting, first week. But no, it's electrifying. I mean, what happened with the audience?
Oh yeah, the Harhus Connors point that they play over and over again, the overheads and the lobs.
Yeah, with
I think another interesting exercise about that year, and if you just play that game, you've done this before, but obviously players in that tournament, Andre Agassi, I think his first year in the U.S. Open might have been 86, 87, but he certainly was in that tournament. And then if you take the years that Connors started playing professional tennis to when he stopped playing and was still playing to a high level, if you take that as a milestone, the 91 U.S. Open, and then you take Agassi's career to where he retired after the 2006 match, and if you take those two players and the amount of time those two players were competitive, it's incredible.
On the beginning side of that, you can take Rosewall. Rosewall got to the Wimbledon final in '74, and he got the Wimbledon final in '54, the year I was born, 1954. Then '74, he plays Connors. I mean, he didn't do so well. Connors had beat him at Wimbledon a couple months prior.
Right.
But 20-year run, 2 finals. And Jimmy took it all the way to '91, where he got out to the semis and came up a little bit short against Courier. But that's 40 years. But then you have to add Agassi. But one thing is that those three players stayed so close to the baseline.
Right.
And you just think, okay, close to the baseline, short, compact swings, just, like Agassi, the players definitely listened to one another. And Connors was asked what his legacy was, and he said, letting people in tennis know that you can take the ball on the rise. And when, many years later, when Agassi retired, he goes, well, I took it one step further than Jimmy. I proved that you could take the ball on the rise and hit top. Jimmy hit top, it certainly was more of a flat hit, the revolutions per second compared to an Agassi.
Right.
Talking about Agassi with ball striking, Steve Young was with us for 5 years. Started off with a 2-year program, and he stayed 3 more years because he got his 4-year degree. Maybe even done some grad work because it was Tyler Junior College and University of Texas at Tyler. So Steve was down at Bollettieri's. In fact, Aaron Kriegstein was a real quiet guy, but Grosse Pointe, Michigan, and I understand, because I spent time in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. If you want to talk to him about the Detroit Tigers, he's going to light up a little bit. But it was Kriegstein was part of the group and Agassi, so they're at a baseball practice at park where the guys are using a batting machine.
Right.
So Agassi says, hey, can I try that? And, now his son, very good baseball player. And he was definitely radical. He's definitely a guy who's going to go for it. He wasn't pushing anything. He said, turn it up as fast as you can. So he takes a baseball bat with a tennis swing, and the machine's going as fast as it can. He runs forward, hitting them out of the air. And these baseball players just stop and look at the guy. But it's just interesting, the train he got. And again, coming back to what I said about his sister, they didn't have the court in the backyard. They didn't have the ball machine, and Tammy didn't have. So that really, it wasn't like Mike Agassi said, okay, racket up high, low, high, inside out. Went through all the rationale, but it was the story of circumstance where he ended up hitting the ball like that.
Similar to Roddick's serve, I would imagine.
Yeah. Stan Boston, the South African, was working with him. It was a very humble story because he said, hey, I was working with him and I didn't teach him to serve. He discovered it on his own. We have the film where his mother, I believe his mother, Blanche, passed away not too long ago. So I think the same year his father did, but he had a regress palm up. And the word she uses, his serve was pitiful. Everything else looked, pretty good as far as, trying to, turn, use his legs. One thing with Roddick, all these players, I could talk about Roddick. We'd have podcasts just on Jimmy, any of these guys. Andy Roddick stories, but Roddick, he used to say that I don't know how I hit it, I just hit it. But he does now say, I wish he'd go back to the old, it's all in the legs. It is true that the power source comes through the ground.
Right.
But, and I know you got some photos that are not up yet, but maybe they haven't made the mark, but the one that's on the floor in your office is of Roddick. And this was Craig Tiley. So back in the day, there was in Texas, Wichita Falls, they didn't have 10s. They had 12s, 14s, 16s, and 18s. So there's 8 tournaments to win, and we thought we could have students win 4. And so Tiley comes back and goes, John Roddick, because he beat one of our players, and he goes, John Roddick. I said, how good's this kid Roddick? And he goes, he's good, but his brother's going to be awesome. I said, why do you say that? He goes, well, he's 7 years old, and all he did, it's so hot in the summertime, is he just hit the backboard the entire time, didn't stop. But the backboard was right by where people would come to hand their scores in. In a tournament like that, it's not just the winners go to take the balls in because there's a back draw and feed in. You got to find out when you play next. And so both players are walking up. So he just would hit the backboard, stop, and go, who won? He asked 2 questions. Who won? He goes, what's the score? And he just turned around and started hitting. So here's a 7-year-old, some 15-year-olds are walking by and go, hey, what was the score? But he hit the ball. That's the it thing.
Right.
Roddick was asked, I can remember rereading Gilbert's book, Winning Ugly, because he had won 23 matches in a row. And it's a great read. It's a simple read. But Roddick was once asked, "How do you play so well?" And he said, "I just pretend my mother's life is on the line." I mean,
He's such a funny guy. I had the opportunity at the Delaware Beach Tennis Center every year to work the special pro clinic where the players who were on the Champions Tour event, which is cool about that event, they combine a Champions Tour event with an ATP event. And so just the list kind of Ivan Lendl, I think Pat Cash, just several, famous players. And one year I got partnered up with Andy Roddick. And so I'm basically the ball feeder, and I'm there if they need any assistance, and so it's an hour clinic they have just people rotating, groups of 6 rotating through. And I'm kind of suggesting some things as needed. And we get to about, 15 minutes in, and Andy turns to me and says, "God, what should we do? I've got no idea what to do with these people." And so I just said, "Well, Andy, I think it would be great if you actually just hit a couple serves to them." And he's like, I can't say this word on this podcast, but oh man, I'm not going to do that. Oh, my shoulder from that last night. He hadn't played many matches, and he was serving, in the stadium court. He went and did it, and it was incredible because every single serve, probably 50% or 75% pace, every single serve was right on the service line. But the whole situation was quite funny. But just his sense of humor with the students who were there, and then with me as just kind of an assistant coach, was really, really funny. You can get a pretty good sense of what kind of guy he was, and probably one of the best post-match interviews you'd ever see in tennis.
Yeah, a funny guy. I believe the oldest brother is Lawrence. His son is a pretty good tennis player. When he was really young, he used the GreatBase curriculum. So it wasn't a handful of times. It was 3-4 times where I was out at Roddick's training coaches. Now, John wasn't there. He was with Andy, so I show up. But then I was at the US Open. I ended up sitting at the same table, rain delay, and I just went up and thanked him for the opportunity to work his academy. And I said, "I coached against you when you were a kid." And he knew the names Clayton Stanley and Chad Clark, and he just looked at me and goes, "Victory or death." Because, that's one thing with Andy. He learned so much about competition from his older brother. Famous story with Macy. I think Rick's great. Andy and others, Kenan and
Capriati.
Sharapova. Capriati, she started with Jimmy Everett, but they definitely spent time with Rick. And Rick, he's a Pied Piper. He's a great motivator. But he tells a story about, so the listeners think, well, he just brought him up from A to Z. He really didn't spend that much time with the Williamses, but enough, a healthy amount of time. But he tells a story that they're playing flag football, and Roddick's the youngest, Andy, and he just goes down, and some big guy's got the ball. Because he's born in Nebraska, spent time in Texas, he just goes down and tries to tackle the guy. But one thing, you mentioned, I've done quite a bit of this. It's not so prevalent today because there's just not as much money as there is in tennis, the corporate outings. I've traveled before where, I'm just going to a clinic to help the superstars, to help the players.
Right.
One time, Tim Mayotte was just off the tour, and I was doing this work for Tennis Corporation of America. So Tim shows up, and same thing. He just does not know what to do. And, because, there's going to be like 240 people. And I'm going, okay, we have 16 indoor courts. It was converted later to less courts. But I've got an air horn. As everybody comes in, they get a name tag, and then they get on their name tag just, Brandon, large letters, and there's a number. So if it's 1 through 16, so Brandon's you go to court 7, you start at court 7. So you get everybody in the bleachers, you just look at your name tag, and you go to that court. And 7 goes to 8, and 8 goes to 9. And I said, no, this is the best way to do it. He goes, okay. So we have all these 5-minute rotations. So they get, and he was knocking on the door to be a Wimbledon champion. Obviously a big time player. So they get on his court and they just volley a few. And I have somebody, this is long before cell phones, I have somebody with a camera like boom, 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 next. So everybody hit a few balls with him, got their photo taken with him.
Yep.
One of my favorite corporate outing stories was one of my students was hosting it. It's a fundraiser, great charity. But, can't remember exactly what the charity was, but Ponca City, Oklahoma. So I fly into Tulsa, and named Steve Smith, so Stan Smith. Now there's the book, I'm Not a Shoe. I think that's the title. Because Stan Smith, to digress, he had the Adidas shoe in the 70s, 80s. I mean, Wimbledon champion in 72, so maybe it was even before the 80s. Laver had one as well, but it came back as a walking shoe. So Adidas brings it back. Stan Smith made more the first year that walking shoe came out than he did in his entire career.
Wow.
So people, Stan Smith, the player, he's the shoe. So it's funny, you get to an airport, and so Tim Gullickson was part of it, and Tim was coming from another plane, and so I know Tim, so we see each other, and we walk up, and we just hear Stan Smith, and a person comes up to him and says, because he's got a sign up, says S. Smith, so Stan, limousine driver, so he goes, S. Smith, so Stan walks up and says, you looking for Stan Smith? He said, no, Steve Smith. He goes, is this for the Ponca City tennis fundraiser? He goes, yeah. I goes, oh, you must meet Stan Smith. He goes, no, I'm here to get Steve Smith. And he knew me because of training the kids and all at the club. The pro is Guy Weinold, who's now he's not in tennis, but based in Austin, does really one business. His wife, Lisa, she's a manager of the Austin Tennis Academy. So she has some off-court position with them. So Stan, the guy, I show up and the guy's there to pick us up. So Tim and I get on this small plane, private plane. We fly from Tulsa to Ponca City, and Stan rides in a station wagon. And he's a Wimbledon champion. But actually, what happened was these people did it up to the point where Stan was at the pizza party and playing team tennis, and usually that's not the case. But so we walk around a corner, and if there was one, there was like 300 kids at this school. And so Stan, he gets in front, and you can only tell, stories to young kids about being a Wimbledon champion for so long. So I went up and kind of whispered to him. I said, Stan, you want me to get him off the bleachers? I can. And it's like, okay, run around the courts, and you give each kid a number, and you start just, okay, we're going to spread out, get a partner, throw and catch, and bring everybody back in. But that's a kicker with.
I think another great one is being on court with Ivan Lendl. As a player, he's so serious. And in this clinic, there was not one player in that clinic he wasn't willing to just bust their chops. 85-year-old ladies, he was just giving them the hardest time, just ripping them. And one of these ladies in the clinic, and this is a different year, one of the ladies in the clinic comes up to him and says, so what do you think about the forehand grip? What forehand grip are the players playing with today? It's the same as when you played. Speaking of forehand grips, his grip is almost on a forehand grip for his one-handed backhand. I don't know how he hits top.
Well, he puts the wrist down. It's like McEnroe. They have very, very much the same grip, but McEnroe had the open racket face and rolled it. Yeah. Where Lendl same grip and collapsed the wrist so the racket was closed. So
she asked him about the grip, and I'm standing there kind of with my racket behind my back, and he kind of says, he goes, this guy's the tennis coach. Ask this guy. And, of course, I start going into the GreatBase explanation of the forehand grips, and he very, very quickly told me to shut up, and we moved on to the next thing. But just the way he handled himself was really, really funny. But
actually, the way he talked to Judy Murray, because Judy Murray was always there when he was coaching Andy. Like, are you here again?
And Carla's, and they were practicing at the Delray Tennis Centers. Andy lives in Miami, and Ivan lives in Vero Beach, and so they'd meet halfway, and they were practicing at the stadium court when I was working there, and Carla tells the story. She probably loves tennis even more than I do, and she was just watching these practices, day in, day out. And she basically said that each practice was basically just Lendl holding up, and for those of you listening on Spotify, just holding up his finger to his lips and telling him to shh.
Yeah, I've heard Carla tell that story. Carla,
really good story.
The thing with grips. There's a film with Rosewall. There's a film with Sampras. There's a film with so many players. And they're asked about what grip they use, and they kind of go, I use this one. It's like with Gilbert, and he's asked about grips. He goes, I don't do grips. They're coaching people. And, say, for example, Wayne Ferrer's doing an outstanding job with TFO, but don't think he's changing the grip on that backhand volley.
Right.
I'll tell you one thing about Stan Smith is getting people to project their voice. So I'm there helping with all the clinics and helping just, I flew in, but like 6 guys from our program drive up from Tyler, Texas to Ponca City, Oklahoma. And it was on for several years. So it's in an auditorium. There's literally thousands of people, and there's no person for the chair. So Stan Smith, I remember Steve, you will do it. I go, yeah, okay. So Stan coached me. He said, have you done this before? I said, yeah, I've been in the chair before, but I've been in the chair with, this many people. He goes, you will make it or break it. With a match, if there's no umpire, there's no match really. So I looked at him and said, you want Frank Hammond or Mike Blanchard? And I was like, Advantage, Borg. And, I could do either one. And I one time was at, they don't have these tournaments anymore, these events. It was a Sunshine Cup for boys. It was a Continental Cup for girls. Basically 18 and under. Now they're calling it the Billie Jean King Cup, Fed Cup, and Davis Cup. And I told the juniors, I would say, we'll stay and watch this. It was Steffi Graf and Mary Pierce was going to be an exhibition. It was right here, your backyard. You've taught there. You know right where it is. So Delray Beach Tennis Center. And so Jim Pierce, obviously there's a positive and negative, but Jim Pierce is a pretty intense tennis parent. He stands up and says, don't keep score. So Steffi kind of looks and he goes, just play points, don't keep score. And Steffi says, yeah, okay. And so these 2 world-class players, Graf and Pierce, are playing points. Everyone left. They could have played a bunch of tiebreakers, but there was nobody announcing the score, and just kind of went away. What else you got on your interior design here? I think people need to come and visit. This place has got a great vibe for it. I think just sitting in this classroom, we're making a podcast. My favorite memorabilia is we have a director's chair, and on the back of the director's chair, it's from the Vic Braden Tennis College. And actually, we're going to post it on Facebook. It'll be on Instagram. And we have a rule for the director's chair that no one sits in it. Vic Braden, the master. Thank you, Vic. But you want to have any closing comments? Again, I think it's fun just to talk about the history of tennis, go on about players, the insight. I know kids, I tell kids all the time, you got to do your homework. But I'm telling you, we have some podcasts, like they should definitely listen to one on tennis math or Bill Jacobson on stats. Because I think when people start to study what we've put together, oh, you mean the people that make you hit off a cone? That's the first glimpse.
Right.
Or someone who comes the first time. And it's like, well, there's a lot more to it than that.
Right. No, I think tennis history is extremely important. I was talking to a student yesterday or today, and a lot of students that I work with, either they're members of other private clubs, or maybe they're members of the private clubs that we manage, but in many cases they are doing other tennis events at other clubs. And he said, well, I've asked my pro if he knows anything about tennis history, and he just kind of says, no, I don't. And I think it's really common in tennis, and it's probably less common in other sports. But I think that was an important part of what we were trying to do here is when you walk in to have not just photos of Roger and Rafa and Venus and Serena, the players that kind of everyone knows from today, but to have some things that are from the past to kind of, give everyone a little bit of history when they walk through. And it just, I think there's a couple other things on the walls, obviously, but I think that's really just a way to make people who are fans of the sport and love the sport kind of enjoy being in this space with us. So,
with tennis history, I think one thing that's also important for the junior tennis players. I know some parents will be driving around listening to these podcasts. People need to know their own history. I've always said to so many kids, don't be discouraged, but you have a late start and a bad start. And with traces of the old, with for example, if someone's changing a grip, it's not like just snap your fingers. You just have to know, you didn't go to the net till you're 15 years old and started playing when you were 5. 10 years is a long time. and they go to the net like they're doing a backflip on a balance beam. It's not that dangerous. I mean, you might get hit by a tennis ball, but it's not a lacrosse ball. It's not a hockey puck. But I think you have to know your own history. And I'm telling kids, I know a lot of 40-year-olds that are still teenagers. If you're lazy when you're 12, you're probably going to be lazy when you're 22.
Right.
So I think that's another point to pound. And so for me, it's like this girl from England, Emma Raducanu, was in everybody's thought process because it was just recent where she won the Grand Slam and first person to come through the qualies to do that. But okay, she, her private school and the private tennis club, they're right next to one another basically. And there was times where she practiced 3 times a day. She was well taught. She was extremely well taught, and that whole thing, no substitute for a good beginning. And if someone doesn't have a good beginning, they can become a great player, but really need to have a healthy work ethic. So, when you're around really good tennis players, they don't talk about their wins. They don't talk about winning Wimbledon, the triumphs, the setbacks. They talk about how hard they worked. They just talk about the lifestyle. They certainly will talk about what their family did for them to get them down the road. I think even with tennis parents, I tell tennis parents, you should not only tell your child your history, but tell them your parents, the grandparents' history, and just have an appreciation. How's it go? You have to understand the past to deal with the present, work towards the future. So I'm big on character, and I'm certainly more interested in someone's tennis background as far as, like say Richard Williams. I mean, he couldn't even really feed balls.
Right.
And it's like we're going to hit more balls than everybody else. Okay? It's not rocket science. And he wasn't a tennis person, but he looked at it and said, some people say, well, you slide like a fox, that we could end on with the movie coming out, the Williams sisters, that there was some money put on the table with Reebok, and there were some sponsorship dollars, obviously, that funded them for several years before they started making money, and maybe that sponsorship would have gone away if they went out there and they were just teeing off on everything, but they weren't playing, bite your fingernails, climb the fence, little kid push ball.
Right.
They were trying to bang the ball like a pro.
Right.
And he had foresight, and in some ways broke the mold. And I do think that a lot of people are very motivated by his story, and but I do think that it's like as great as they are, like Venus. Excuse me, I'll go with Serena first. She opens up on her overhead. If you watch her, she'll open up on her overhead. For the longest time, I used to say the only person that can beat Serena is Serena.
Mm-hmm.
And doesn't really have a clean loop on the backhand side. Venus will drop the racket, hit below the wrist on the backhand side. I mean, Venus at her prime, I mean, she was just made for grass court tennis.
Right.
But the brain, quantity wins. But really what you want is quantity and quality. So the reps. So, but I tell people, well, you can stay with this forehand. You can stay with this backhand. You're either a 1 or 2. You're all in. If you're going to make this change, it's not, you can't be like a 2. You got to be totally committed to it.
Just do it, yeah.
But I like the character stories. We did that another time. Just to zone in on one player. Like so many names were brought up today. Jimmy Connors, Gloria. Jimmy, I'm your mother. If I can hit the ball down your throat, I will. He wins Wimbledon, and he says, this is what I always want to do. And I've only seen that this was called at one point it was called the Nick Baltieri rule, because Nick, when one of his players would win, he'd jump right on the court, and he'd have his arm right around the kid when they were getting the trophy. Richard one time came on the court, but the parents, the coaches, no one's really allowed on the court except for the player. But Jimmy, when he won Wimbledon, said, this is what I always wanted to do. And Gloria's right there, said, no, you always wanted to beat your older brother. And it's really interesting, siblings, so many times it's the older child that, like Agassi, we've talked about him a little bit, where he had 3 siblings that beat down the path. But no, if you get a chance to come to Boynton Beach, FM Tennis Performance Center. It's got a great vibe, and anybody who loves tennis would just love to walk through and look at the walls. You've done a great job with that.
Thank you. And the first ever GreatBase Tennis podcast about interior design.
Interior design. It is true that character's on the inside, reputation is on the outside. But Brandon, thanks. Listeners, thanks. Next week, 65's in the books.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thanks.